Hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture on the course Sociology of Media and Communication. So, today we are going to continue with the third approach or perspective to understand media, and this is the feminist approach to understand media. Now, the first question that might come to your mind is, why do we need a feminist approach? Well, traditionally media has been primarily male dominant, and portrayals and representations have been reflecting hegemonic structures and perspectives of society, which have been predominantly patriarchal and male dominated, which is why the feminist approach challenges a pre-existing kind of portrayals and representations and tries to talk about why so and so representation has been a part of mainstream media. Essentially, feminist media theory is also rooted in how we should understand the feminist movement at large, where this movement and ideology, or you may call it theoretical perspective, primarily interrogates the unequal relations that exist between genders and societal processes and structures. So, feminist media theory, it interrogates questions of representation, power and ideology in visual culture, and focuses on how gendered construction of meaning and spectatorship is a big part of media representations. In many ways, the feminist media theory also challenges patriarchal assumptions which are embedded in certain media forms. Now, primarily when we look at the idea of feminist media theory, it is also borrowing and drawing from larger feminist thinking. So, the larger feminist thinking is rooted in challenging patriarchal ideas and meanings as part of societal processes and structures like the family, kinship, questions of class, caste, religion, etc. Therefore, this perspective also sort of interrogates what happens in the media sphere by using and trying to understand these unequal relations which also exist in other spheres. So, the key questions that the feminist perspective asks are, how are women represented in media? Then, when there is representation, who controls that representation or gaze? And what ideological structures shape the representation of women and gendered questions in pre-existing media and visual culture. So, these are some questions that we are going to try to understand from the feminist lens in terms of how to look at this relationship between media and communication. So, the theoretical foundations that I have considered for this lecture draw from questions and perspectives of Marxism, psychoanalysis and also structuralism, primarily to take home this idea that when we think about media, it is not a neutral entity, but it is actually also reproducing pre-existing gendered and other power relations. We will do these questions of representation in further detail in unit 4, where we will discuss how representation is very ideological and not merely reflective. Ideological in the sense that how it is a part of how we think about questions of gender outside the media. So, first let us talk about a very important book, Ways of Seeing by John Berger, which you could also watch as a documentary which is divided into 4 parts, freely available on YouTube, where he looks at different forms of media and visual culture in pre to capitalist societies. So, he is also looking at pre-capitalist as well as capitalist societies, and he focuses on art, paintings, advertising and looks at gendered representation. Berger's idea of this book, Ways of Seeing, is primarily communicating this message that the way we see things is actually governed by our social economic condition, and therefore, he has also been influenced by the Marxist critique of what media and communication is. Primarily to think about this way of seeing, where we are looking at something, an art product or an advertisement as socially and culturally constructed. We did talk a little bit about it when we sort of discussed how we have to think about our social condition in how we are interpreting a form of media or an art. And Berger sort of talks about how one's visual perception is shaped by that ideology, and therefore, images and visual cultures reproduce dominant power structures in society. So, the way that we see a particular object or painting is where we are actually looking at it from our own social, economic, cultural perspective. So, in most of these paintings that he sort of documents and talks about, there is a very clear way in which one sees that the men act and the women appear. What it means is that in most of the paintings that Berger documents, there is this idea that the women are posing, they are appearing, whereas the men act. This is also a way in which the male role is seen as the masculine, action oriented role, whereas for the women it is primarily the submissive, emotive, appearance kind of role. And in many of these paintings and later on in advertisements, films, in photographs, one can see that the women are shown as internalizing the male gaze. So, if a woman is portrayed as coy or shy, having a blushing smile on her face, etc., it means that she is enjoying the way that she is being seen as an object, and therefore, there is an internalization of that male gaze. Very importantly, Berger also talks about how self-surveillance is a disciplinary mechanism that women employ in the way that they seek to shield themselves from the world. Interestingly, the self-surveillance again is not specific to portrayal in media, it is also a part of how women generally behave in society. For instance, if one observes women who are traveling on public transport like buses or trains, or even inside a cab, you will find that they are very often very alert and very conscious of their bodies and their appearances. They are on self-surveillance mode, especially if it is night, where they may be hooked to looking at the Google map to follow the directions, or trying to share their location, the taxi number, in the bus as well, not sleeping, trying to keep an eye out on who is whom. That self-surveillance is a disciplinary mechanism that one learns perhaps because of how we have been socialized as women to be watching out. And that also becomes a part of how Berger analyzes the portrayed women on the paintings or on advertisements and other art forms. Now, women become objectified in visual culture, where their identity is primarily constructed only for male spectatorship and their appearance is prioritized over agency. So, these have been burning questions in feminist media theory, where generally the understanding of gender has been from this vantage point, where women have been portrayed in, be it painting or theatre, songs, etc., from the lens of male gaze. So, this gaze is entirely primarily understood from the male perspective, where the women become just objects which the male spectators generally admire, which is why when we think about item songs in Bollywood, I had also mentioned it in the previous lecture, we can think about how these item songs were also primarily objectifying women with the intent of satisfying what the filmmakers would see as a male spectatorship. So, women generally do not have much agency, particularly in the early years when we think about these art forms and forms of media and communication. Now, Berger talks about two kinds of categories when he is looking at particularly European paintings, nude paintings, and the version of what he sees as the difference between nude and naked. So, he says that when one is naked, it is being oneself, which is generally that physical form of our bodies, which is supposed to be biologically determined. It is also supposed to be a very ordinary natural part of how we are. But in these paintings, when women are portrayed naked, they generally are seen as nude paintings. And the reason is that in the nude, there is a very specific understanding of being seen by others, and the nude is constructed for male pleasure. And this is also one way when we think about the nude versus naked, where Berger says that the naked is being completely undermined by the nude, where these nude paintings are meant for a specific purpose, and the specific purpose is targeting the male population. So, essentially the idea of what he thinks about European oil paintings is that they objectify women, where women are depicted as possessions, properties, and this is linked to questions of larger patriarchal structures, where one can see that women have been differently portrayed in comparison to men, where their individual agencies have little value. Now, in advertising and capitalism, where he is tracking this shift to a primarily capitalist society, he argues that advertisements build on existing painting or art traditions, and women continue to be used as commodities, where desire is constructed through the visual portrayal. For instance, if one looks at advertisements of food products, they would be shown as women models, partaking in sensuous consumption to portray this kind of a relationship between sexuality and food. So, whereas if one thinks about it logically, food has nothing to do with sexuality in that sense, but the images are used to create that kind of direct linkages. For instance, many of you may be familiar with this one ad of Katrina Kaif for a slice, which is a mango drink. And this ad, when one looks at, seems to us as a message of just an advertisement for mango slice. But going a little deeper into it, one actually finds that when Katrina Kaif is drinking that, it is conveying a linkage between food or drink, in this case juice, and sexuality. So, the idea of how the woman actors are portrayed, desire is constructed, it is through these images. Now, when we think about spectatorship, who the spectators are, for Berger, the viewer is primarily positioned as male, women depicted as passive, and power generally lies with the observer. Now, I would like to state here that Berger is not defending what happens in the representations. Instead, he is actually questioning what is happening and telling us how the viewer has been generally positioned as the male and the women as passive. So, in that context, what he has managed to sort of do is bring about this understanding of how we can see that media representations reflect clear social, cultural, political kind of ideologies. So, it is also in a way a continuation of the neo-Marxist approach, where they think about this role of media in building consciousness, and then Berger explains to us how does the media build this consciousness. So, gender is something where the media builds this consciousness by looking at things from a male perspective. Now, the second thinker that I want to talk about when we think of the feminist approach to media is Laura Mulvey. Now, Laura Mulvey uses psychoanalysis and extends this critique, or rather expands it, to think about cinema, and she focuses on unconscious structures of viewing using a psychoanalytical perspective. Now, Laura Mulvey talks about this in her essay called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, where she combines feminist approaches with psychoanalytical tools to provide a critique of Hollywood cinema. What is this psychoanalytic framework? So, Sigmund Freud talks about scopophilia, which is primarily pleasure in looking, and Lacan talks about the mirror stage and identification. Now, according to Mulvey, if one looks at cinema, it actually activates unconscious desires, which is those of pleasure in how they want to look at others, as well as questions of identification. So, while we think about films, television, etc., you can also think about the many times there have been censorship or attempts to censor media forms. And then you may wonder that why is it there a need to censor these art forms? That need actually emerges from this idea of where we are thinking about primarily unconscious desires which representations can lead to, and therefore, the urge to control stems from controlling those unconscious desires. She talks about very similar to Berger's way of seeing an idea called the male gaze, where cinema is seen as structured by the male gaze and women become objects of visual pleasure. Again, men are seen as active agents, whereas women are passive subjects. Now, she talks about 3 looks which are all structured by the male gaze. The first is the camera, the second is the character, the third is the audience, and all these 3 looks have a similar pattern, that they are all driven by what she would call the male gaze. Now, what is it that the looks do? For instance, the camera look. For most periods of how the camera has been used, it is seen as a tool that enhances the way that one is socially represented. And in cases of gender, where we are thinking about women, the camera has again played a huge role in how women are portrayed or women are photographed. The character is also a very significant role, where women have been expected to play certain characters. For instance, in Bollywood films of 70s and 80s, primarily you would find women playing characters of the wife or the mother. So, generally it is not an individual who is important, but a kinship relationship. The audience look again is from the perspective of people who are watching the film, who will look at the women and the men and identify them as certain characters. So, Amitabh Bachchan was known as the angry young man primarily because he played a lot of characters of the angry young man in Bollywood films in 70s and 80s. Whereas, for women they would be understood as the glamorous one or the mother one, etc. So, in that sense, how the audience also interprets these characters based on gendered understanding. So, when we think about scopophilia is actually driven by the idea that cinema encourages this voyeuristic pleasure derived from looking, because the women become erotic objects. So, they are dressed particularly, they look particular, they are asked to behave particularly, because the male gaze wants to derive pleasure from that voyeurism. Now, there is also a way in which we can think about this scopophilia to be connected to fetish, where women become fetishized objects and bodies, and therefore, it is seen as an idea of controlling the male understanding of spectatorship. From this perspective, where we have a visual depiction of how women are fetishized. So, actresses, people who play roles in films, televisions, etc., are expected to look in a particular way. This expected to look in a way is not only about limiting to those visual images which would be in these art forms. In fact, there are several people who comment on women's looks and bodies even when they are not in these realms. For instance, if there is someone who may have topped an exam and got the limelight in the media, they might be trolled for their looks because they look a particular way. These chances increase when it is a woman or a girl. So, voyeurism in fact sort of encourages through the visual culture and portrayal in films, etc., where women become the passive spectacle, and it reinforces patriarchal order primarily because it is based on this understanding of men look and women appear, as Berger would also critique. So, the male generally is understood as an active, very energetic kind of character, where they are the ones who drive the narrative, whereas women halt the narrative or deposit for visual display, and one can see that there is a clear gender division of labor in media representation. These ideas of gender and how they are represented can be very well also illustrated when we think about how, when films oriented or geared towards issues of gender are made, get called women's films or women oriented issues. But when most films have a male narrative and a male protagonist, they are not called male oriented films. The identification generally of the spectator, because most of the spectators are also imagined to be male, is with the male protagonist, where the camera aligns with the male perspective. And it is very important to remember this, that the camera, a technological device, is not doing it on its own, but is instead rooted in the social cultural context, where women are seen as secondary and gender is a lens to interpret how we understand camera and films reinforcing patriarchal subjectivity. So, the cinematic techniques are also rooted in objectifying women. You will recall several songs, especially in Bollywood, where you would find the object and the camera being targeted to certain body parts like the waist or the breast, with the lyrics of those songs also sort of complementing it. Very recently we have had a controversy about Nora Fatehi and the song that she was a part of, which again sort of brings back this question of how questions of gender are represented. So, in most of the female bodies, you will see that when they are focused on the camera, there is a close up, and these techniques of lighting and enlarging, they enhance the erotic content that is associated with the portrayal of female bodies and questions of gender in the films. So, while one looks at these representations, you will also see that the women are seen as obstacles, and we also have this phrase damsel in distress, who is seen as needing a man to resolve the conflict, solve the problem, and what happens is that the man is inevitably the savior. So, in most films you will find particularly in the 90s, 2000s scenes where a woman is being tried to be raped or sexually harassed, and the hero shows up in time and saves her. These scenes have also been critiqued for the way that they have portrayed women's oppression, and questions of how the rape scenes also then become scenes or visuals which men want to gaze at. Perhaps you will also be familiar with how Google searches of rape scenes in films dominate pornographic content, very well highlighting how the male gaze is directed towards watching the woman's body being represented in very, very different ways. So, Mulvey's intervention is rooted in asking for breaking this narrative convention of representing the women's body as only a passive subject. And this is where both Berger and Mulvey are important, because they are both talking about visual culture and cinema, although Berger is broader in his scope compared to Mulvey, and both critique the male dominance in representation. Now, the common themes running through these two texts is that they look at the objectification of women and critique it, and also talk about the male control of gaze while ideologically reproducing patriarchy. The differences is situated in their frameworks, where Berger has a more Marxist influence, whereas Mulvey has a more psychoanalytic emphasis, clearly meaning that their methodologies become different in the process. Now, when we think about the feminist perspective and this approach to understand media, primarily we should be thinking about how media naturalizes and reinforces pre-existing gendered stereotypes and roles, and questions of representation are important because they are seen as engaging and shaping reality. So, the feminist critique exposes some of these hidden structures which are continued to be essentialized as part of media reproduction. So, when we think about contemporary relevance, and this is again something which we will continue the discussion on, we should also think about how digital media reproduces that gaze and social media intensifies what would be called self-surveillance. We of course have an influencer culture dominating us, where femininity is also commodified in many ways. One will be familiar with many of those get ready with me reels, ideas of makeup reels, etc., again reinforcing the way that women are expected to behave or women behave in the digital space as well. As I said, this is a huge topic by itself, and we will take it up in the unit 3 when we discuss digital media in detail. There have also been critiques of Mulvey, which is primarily rooted in the way that she is asked to also think about female spectators, and that her study neglects this idea of what would be female spectatorship. Questions of limited intersectionality continue to remain also a big critique, primarily because the study is basically rooted in Western context, and especially in ideas of primarily a white audience. Now, when we think about intersectional feminism and primarily how it has also influenced media theory, we should also remember that not all women are represented equally, and therefore, in media theory there is more discussion needed on diverse perspectives, where we have to also think about how caste, religion, race, sexuality, class, etc., they complicate the male gaze. So, the understanding is that when we think about questions of representation, these theoretical foundations that we have outlined are important, but we also move forward to think about how neoliberal feminism could also be critiqued. And when we think about this question of choice, we need to also complicate that idea of choice. Very often we also need to be mindful of portrayals where women are given symbolic visibility, but there may not be structural kind of empowerment, primarily because it is difficult to achieve structural empowerment and it is easier to have symbolic visibility. So, what this means is that perhaps it is not enough to only have a black or an African American representation or a Dalit representation, but it is also important to have more diverse narratives from these marginalized sections. So, questions of representation are no longer only about having a particular person representing it, but also about the dialogue and the discussion centered around it. So, what this approach rooted in feminist theory does is that it reveals these questions of power that are rooted in questions of representation, and both John Berger and Laura Mulvey remain foundational, where we should be more critically engaging with these questions of how can we think about representation, diversity and inclusivity. Like I said, it is not enough today to only have one woman or one representation. It is also important that we have more and more stories, more dialogue, because the media continues to shape consciousness, as discussed by the Frankfurt School, where representations in media have a very important role in terms of how can we think about changing ideas of society. Thank you.